what if the darkest truths were hidden in plain sight? From a haunted farm where family's killers remained unknown, to a killer clown who fooled an entire city. These are stories that defy logic and chill the soul. Tonight, we unravel 5 of the most disturbing true crime cases ever told. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about fear, murder, and the evil that lurks in the shadows. In rural Bavaria, Germany, on a remote farm called Hinterkaifeck, the Gruber family lived in seclusion. The family was composed of Andreas Gruber, his wife, their daughter, and their son-in-law. A maid, hired by the family, worked for them as well. The area was isolated, no neighbors for miles, which meant any sound, any movement would be noticed. But something sinister lurked on the farm. Over the course of several weeks, Andreas reported hearing strange noises in the attic and outside his window. He discovered footprints leading from the forest to the barn and back again, but no one could figure out where they came from. The farm had a feeling of dread about it, but the ultimate horror was still to come. On the night of March 31st, 1922, the entire Gruber family was brutally murdered. Andreas and his wife were found bludgeoned to death in their bedroom. Their daughter and son-in-law met a similar fate. The maid was murdered later, her body found in the same area. The killer had used a pickaxe, which was found next to the bodies. But what made this crime even more disturbing was the aftermath. The murderer didn't immediately flee. The killer seemed to have taken his time, making himself at home in the farmhouse. It is believed that the killer spent several days in the house after the murders, living in the attic, stealing food, and even making signs of being present, like lighting a fire. The discovery of a bloody axe and the strange behavior of the killer left many questions unanswered. Authorities arrived, but they found no signs of forced entry. It seemed as though the murderer knew the family, which made the case even more disturbing. The local police and investigators turned up no concrete leads. The family's close circle of acquaintances didn't seem to have any motive for murder. The case was shrouded in mystery. Despite the investigation, there was a haunting detail that was too eerie to ignore. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises emanating from the house for days after the killings. Some claimed to have heard the sound of a violin playing, while others said they could hear whispers. What was even more unnerving was the discovery of footprints leading to and from the house that seemed to vanish into thin air. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the discovery of a footprint in the snow that appeared to have come from the killer himself. The trail led directly from the woods to the barn and then to the house. It was impossible to trace it any further. The local police were stumped. At one point, rumors started to swirl that the murderer could have been someone hiding in the attic the entire time. Someone who had learned the family's routine and exploited their vulnerability. But who could it have been? Several suspects were suggested, but no one could truly explain the eerie events surrounding the murders. In the end, the case went cold. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about what happened on the Hinterkaifeck farm. Some suggest that it was a family member who had lost control, possibly the son-in-law who had a strained relationship with the family. Others believed it was a stranger who had been living on the farm in secret, hiding in the attic and making the noises Andreas had reported hearing. There were also whispers that a local man known to have had a relationship with the maid, could have been the killer. However, the police were never able to uncover enough evidence to arrest anyone. The mystery has haunted the region for decades. To this day, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved. The house where the murders took place still stands, abandoned, and is considered one of the most haunted locations in Germany. Tourists visit the area, drawn by the grim history of the crime. And despite numerous investigations over the years, no one has ever been charged with the murders. The strange circumstances surrounding the case, the lingering presence in the house, the mysterious footprints, the lack of clear motives, ensure that Hinterkaifeck will remain a chilling unsolved mystery forever. Villisca, Iowa, was a sleepy town in the early 1900s. The town was small, the streets quiet, and the people friendly. Families lived in peace, and everyone knew one another. The Moore family, consisting of Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, were a beloved family in town. They had recently invited 2 friends of their children to spend the night with them, creating a cheerful atmosphere in the house. But on the night of June 9th, 1912, that peace was shattered. In a shocking act of violence, the entire family, along with the 2 children, was slaughtered in their sleep. The killer used an axe to bludgeon each of the victims, and the crime was so brutal that it sent shockwaves throughout the town and the entire country. The bodies were discovered the next morning when a neighbor noticed the family's usual morning activities hadn't occurred. The Moore family's house was eerily silent. When the neighbor entered the home, the sight was horrifying. The bodies were sprawled throughout the house, their faces covered by sheets. The murderer had taken care to cover their victims' faces, perhaps to hide the brutality of the crime, or perhaps as a perverse act of respect. What was even more chilling was the fact that the killer seemed to have spent the night in the house. After the murders, the killer had made himself at home, eating a meal from the family's food supply, and even sitting in a rocking chair. Local authorities were called to the scene, but the case quickly became one of the most puzzling investigations in history. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen. The axe used in the crime belonged to the Moore family. There were no clues pointing to the identity of the killer. Theories began to form. Some believed the killer was someone who knew the family well. Was it a relative or an acquaintance? Others thought it might be a traveling man who had stayed in town. The townspeople were gripped by fear, and suspicions ran high. The killer's methodical actions raised several disturbing questions. How did the murderer know that the family would be vulnerable? How did he remain undetected for so long? Some investigators speculated that the killer had been hiding in the house before the murders, waiting for the family to fall asleep. What was perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that the killer had returned to the house after committing the murders. The fact that the killer had eaten and rested in the home suggested that he felt comfortable there, as though it wasn't just about the murders. It was about the complete violation of a family's private space. Over the years, several suspects were considered. One of the most prominent was a man named Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca at the time of the murders. He had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the crime, and some people believed he was the killer. However, There was no solid evidence linking him to the crime, and the investigation went cold. Another suspect was a man named Frank Jones, a local businessman who had a long-standing feud with Josiah Moore. Despite many theories and potential suspects, the true identity of the killer remained elusive. The Villisca Axe murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved murder cases in American history. Numerous investigations have taken place over the years, but no one has ever been convicted of the crime. The eerie thought that a killer may have been hiding in plain sight, watching the family, still haunts the town of Villisca. The Moore house still stands as a grim reminder of the brutal murders, and the town itself continues to carry the weight of this chilling mystery. At first, it was just weird. I'd walk into a room and see her standing there, staring at me from the corner, not moving. She would be completely still, just watching. I thought she was simply lost in thought, but after the fourth time it happened, I started to feel off. It wasn't like her. She wasn't the type to stand still and stare, and when I asked her about it, she brushed it off. Then, one evening, I came home late from work. I unlocked the door and called her name, but there was no response. The house was eerily quiet. I checked every room, but I couldn't find her. It wasn't until I walked into the kitchen that I saw her. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, and she was crouched behind the counter, watching me. "I didn't want to scare you," she whispered. "I thought I heard something." That's when I realized it wasn't her acting strange. It was something else inside her. As days passed, the behavior became more erratic. She started whispering to herself in the middle of the night, low, indecipherable words. I could hear her pacing around the house, moving through rooms, sometimes stopping to peer through the cracks in doors, or even standing motionless behind furniture, her eyes locked onto me. Every night, I would hear the creaking of her footsteps, just out of reach, as though she was watching me while I slept. It wasn't her anymore. It was something else. One morning, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of our bed, her eyes wide and unblinking. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't respond. Instead, she whispered something in a voice that wasn't hers. "You're not going to make it." It felt like she was gone. Her body was there, but her soul was somewhere else. I started doing some research. I found a disturbing pattern. People who had similar experiences with loved ones exhibited the same behaviors. A demonic presence, something that took hold and slowly drove them mad. I tried to confront her, but she only smiled coldly and asked, "Why don't you trust me?" I tried to leave the house, but every time I would pack, she'd appear from the shadows, watching me, always close behind. I couldn't escape her. She would laugh quietly, her voice sounding more like a growl. "You can't leave. I'm always here." Every time I tried to get out, she would whisper, "I'm watching you." And I knew. She was never really my wife anymore. I had to leave for my own sanity. The night I left, I locked the doors and made sure she couldn't follow. But when I looked back one last time, I saw her silhouette standing in the window, her face pressed against the glass, smiling. "You think you're safe, but I'm always here," she whispered from the darkness. I could feel her eyes on me, wherever I went. She was still watching. In 1692, in the Puritan town of Salem, Massachusetts, something extraordinary and horrifying occurred. It all began when several young girls claimed to be possessed by spirits, and soon after, accusations of witchcraft began to spread like wildfire. The town's deeply religious and superstitious mindset made it fertile ground for fear to take root. The hysteria escalated quickly, and soon the entire community was embroiled in a mass panic. People who had lived alongside each other for years turned on one another, accusing friends, family members, and even strangers of being witches. As the accusations continued to spread, fear became the driving force in Salem. People were arrested based on the flimsiest of evidence. Testimonies from children, unexplained ailments, and simple grudges were enough to condemn someone as a witch. No one was safe, and the lines between reality and superstition became dangerously blurred. People were thrown into prison, where they were tortured into confessing. Many accused others, perpetuating the cycle of fear and paranoia. The court system became a tool of terror, and soon the trials had escalated into a full-blown witch hunt. The witch trials became a spectacle, and the trials themselves were little more than sham proceedings. There was no real evidence of witchcraft, just fear, superstition, and unfounded accusations. But the court accepted the evidence that was presented, including spectral evidence where the accused ghost was said to have appeared to the accusers. The result was a terrifying wave of executions. 20 innocent people were put to death, and many others were imprisoned or tortured. The town was torn apart as people tried to protect themselves by accusing others, and families were destroyed by the paranoia. As the trials raged on, the first seeds of doubt were planted. Some began to question whether the hysteria was driven by real evidence or by fear and greed. Eventually, the trials began to lose steam, and a new governor stepped in, bringing an end to the madness. The trials became a symbol of how fear can drive a community to commit horrific acts. In hindsight, the Salem witch trials are viewed as one of the darkest periods in American history. The aftermath of the trials was devastating. Families were left without loved ones, and the community was forever scarred. The accused, even those who had survived, lived with the shame of having been labeled a witch. The trials left deep psychological scars that would take generations to heal. The hysteria and the wrongful deaths continued to haunt Salem. It served as a grim reminder of how fear and paranoia can take over even the most rational minds. The Salem witch trials may have ended, but their legacy endures. The trials are often cited as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, superstition, and the potential for injustice. To this day, the story of Salem serves as a chilling reminder that in times of fear, reason often gives way to violence. Issei Sagawa's obsession with cannibalism began at a young age. He fantasized about eating human flesh, believing that it would grant him the power he desired. His obsessions grew, and he fixated on a particular woman, Renee Hartevelt, a Dutch student in Paris. Sagawa invited her to his apartment, where his dark plans were set in motion. On the night of June 11th, 1981, Sagawa murdered Renee, shooting her in the back of the head before dismembering her body. He spent several days consuming parts of her flesh and even took photographs of the act. The brutal murder was not a crime of passion, but of obsession. Sagawa's twisted fantasies had come to life. Sagawa was arrested when he attempted to dispose of Renee's remains, but the authorities were initially skeptical. His calm demeanor and apparent lack of remorse shocked everyone. The details of the crime were grotesque, but Sagawa showed no fear of the consequences. Sagawa's case took a bizarre turn when he was declared legally insane and sent to a mental institution. Despite his horrific crime, the French courts did not find him fit to stand trial. The legal system had failed to deliver justice. Sagawa was eventually deported to Japan, where his disturbing story gained him a grotesque kind of fame. Sagawa's media appearances shocked the world. He spoke freely about his crime, relishing the attention he received. His appearances on Japanese talk shows turned him into a morbid celebrity. The fact that he was living freely after such an unspeakable act disturbed many, but his notoriety only grew. Sagawa's story remains one of the most disturbing in modern history. His freedom, despite his brutal crime, highlights the flaws in the legal system. He continues to live in Japan, where he remains a figure of fascination. The legacy of his crime serves as a reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human mind.